que un economista como yo le toque presentar a alguien como el profesor Nicolaides no deja de ser una de estas circunstancias curiosas de la vida. Cuando conocí al profesor Nicolaides hace aproximadamente 5 años, probablemente mucho más tarde que la mayoría de ustedes, descubrí y empecé a entender lo que era. Después he tenido el placer y el honor de conocerle mucho más, incluso de desarrollar una pequeña amistad a lo largo de estos años que nos han llevado hasta aquí hoy. Y por tanto, para mí es un momento muy, muy especial poder tenerle hoy entre nosotros en Madrid, colaborando, pero sobre todo enseñándonos todo lo que él sabe y todo lo que él representa en medicina materno-fetal. Intentar contaros algo sobre quién es el profesor Nicolaides es prácticamente imposible y monopolizaría prácticamente toda la sesión. Simplemente deciros que gracias a él, la Fetal Medicine Foundation se ha convertido en el polo a nivel mundial de desarrollo de medicina materno-fetal. El profesor Nicolaides, a través de más de 1000 artículos publicados a lo largo de estos años, ha sentado en la base de lo que es y lo que sigue siendo la medicina materno-fetal. Por eso es para mí un honor dejaros ahora con el profesor Nicolaides. Prof, please.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I came to Spain today because one of my students, a very good Spanish doctor, was presenting her thesis because she led a lot of the research that we carried out in the last 5 years in relation to screening for trisomies by cell-free DNA analysis in maternal blood. And that was Mark Gill, and she had a brilliant presentation, and she got an honor for that. In that presentation, I referred to my great love and respect for the Spanish doctors. There are many of you here tonight that had come to London and you trained, and I am truly happy to see how much you came back and you're thriving and you're contributing for the benefit of the pregnant women in this country. But what I also want to mention is that a few years ago, when I was still young, I went to King's College Hospital and I fell in love with this concept of fetal medicine. A new professor had come then to London and he gave us a brilliant lecture on ultrasound scanning. And it was a miraculous transformation that happened to me at that time when I saw for the first time the moving images of the fetus inside the mother. It was a revolution in thinking, and to me, that until that time was not sure what to specialize in, I knew immediately that that was my field. Now, at that time, it was very difficult to have access to the ultrasound department because it was controlled by radiologists. So I had to wait until they all went home. I found out where they were hiding the key. So I used to go at night, steal the key, open the ultrasound department, and start learning. But my teacher at that time was also a very nice Spanish boy, and that was Professor Recasens, that I saw here tonight, Joaquim. So here is Spain. You taught me how to scan, and I helped train some of your doctors, and it's a great honor for me to be here tonight. That's that. Now, let me talk about this. Javier promised that I'm going to say to you everything I know. And because I don't know very much, I will finish in, I think, 12 or 13 slides. So, early screening for trisomies by cell-free DNA testing of maternal blood. Now, let's see. I will just discuss some of the things that Mar presented in her thesis today, the performance of screening of this test, how to interpret the results, how to manage the failed result. And you have heard from Vincenzo that in their studies so far, even if they were retrospective and long storage samples, there is a failure rate of about, in their hands, 1 to 2%. In many other series, that failure rate is much higher. So what do you do in these cases? And then, who should be the candidates for having this new test? Everybody? Some? Who? And then a discussion again that is becoming interesting and continuously expanding. For 50 years, the established condition for which we had screening was Down's syndrome. In England, after many, many years, a few months ago, the National Screening Committee has included, as part of the desire to screen, trisomy 18 and 13. It took many years, that discussion, because they were saying, if you look at the conditions, they don't fulfill really most of the criteria of worthiness for screening. Here are 2 chromosomal abnormalities that are lethal. So what is the point of screening for them? Because the fetuses will die anyway. And what is the point of spoiling the test of screening for Downs? Because Downs is a condition that is associated with mental handicap, physical handicap. They live for many, many years. And for some people, they are loved and they're accepted, and for many, they're not. So there is a logic in screening and then deciding whether to continue the pregnancy or not, because there are long-term implications. There were none for trisomy 18 and 13. Eventually, the National Screening Committee in England was convinced to include them purely because they were a beneficial side effect of detecting Downs. At the back of screening for Downs, you could pick up trisomy 18 and 13, and provided you don't increase the unnecessary number of invasive tests, it is worthwhile. That was the conclusion. With the new era of cell-free DNA testing, now can potentially screen for many, many, many things. So the question that all of us involved in obstetrics, pregnancy care, fetal medicine, prenatal diagnosis, is to stop for 1 second and say, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And then we will have continuing discussions on that. So I will try to address some of these questions, but let me begin from the background. Because in Spain, thanks to a lot of good people, the standard of care at the moment is the first trimester combined test, the same as in England. A test that was gradually, over a decade in the 1990s, was introduced. And that test combines maternal age, ultrasound at 12 weeks, with maternal serum, free beta, HCG, and PABA, and detects about 90% of the cases of Downs, about 95% of the cases of trisomy 18 and 13, at a screen or false positive rate of 5%. Last night, before I tried to go to sleep, before I caught the plane to come here, I just looked at the results of the last few years from screening with the combined test. And this is 109,000 pregnancies. And then on this line is the risk cutoff, trisomy 21, 18, 13, and the side effects, Turner, triploidy, other chromosomal abnormalities, and then the normals. If we do the combined test and we take a risk cutoff of 1 in 2, within that group, we will contain about 55% of the cases of Downs, more than 80% of cases of trisomy 18, 70% of trisomy 13, 65% of Turners because they have a very, very big nuchal, and 80% of triploidy because they have extremely abnormal serum biochemistry, and about 14% of some of the other chromosomal abnormalities. And all of that can be achieved at a false positive rate of 0.2%. if we go to a risk cutoff of 1 in 10, which will constitute about 1.4% of the whole population, or a false positive rate of less than 1%, then we can detect more than 75% of Downs, 90, 86, 94 of trisomy 18, 13 Turners, triploidy. So with the combined test, if we have a very high risk cutoff of 1 in 10, which will apply to only about 1% of the population, we can pick up a lot of Downs and many other chromosomal abnormalities. In England, the National Screening Committee recommends that women with a risk of 1 in 100 should have an invasive test, and this month they recommended that these women can have the option of having either an invasive test or a cell-free DNA test. Now, that is that number, 1 in 100. If we take that cutoff, we are picking up about 90 or a bit more of the main trisomies, but also quite a few of the Turners and triploidy. The Turners with a very high nuchal translucency, the most severe type of Turners. At a screen positive rate of 5%. The main benefit of introducing cell-free DNA testing for this subgroup of the population is that we will be still picking up most of this. We will not pick up any of this because the cell-free DNA testing in England will have to be applied only to those 3 things. But the main benefit will be basically to substantially reduce the number of unnecessary invasive tests. I think that the policy in England is wrong, but on the other hand, it is the first country that has introduced a national screening program that includes cell-free DNA testing. So everybody will have the combined test, and then if their risk is more than 1 in 100, they will be offered. They have to be offered that as an option. So I am negative at one hand, but positive at another, because it's the first step. I think that within the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it will be shown that the women will be demanding, the doctors will be demanding that that proportion of the population is expanded to maybe 15% if we have a risk cutoff of 1 in 500, or even 24% if we have a risk cutoff of 1 in 1,000, because we would want to improve on the 92 towards 98, on the 96 towards 99, and so on. So that I start off as the background to this presentation. Now, the Spanish doctors that were working with us did a meta-analysis of all of the studies of cell-free DNA testing that were published in the last 5 years, and they showed very clearly, with most of the studies agreeing, that the cell-free DNA test is very good. It has a detection rate of more than 99%. Remember, my test, the combined test, had a detection rate of 90. So this is better than my test. The false positive rate is less than 0.1. Mine was 5%. So this is a definite advance over what we had before. In terms of trisomy 18 and 13, not as good, not too bad, but not much better than the traditional combined test. The disadvantage of including trisomy 18 and 13 is that it partly spoils the goodness of screening for trisomy 21. because here the detection rate is less good, and more importantly, the false positive rate goes up from less than 0.1% to 0.35. So by including the McDonald ideology, the Americanization of thought, the bigger the Big Mac, the bigger the McDonald's, the fatter the women are, the better they are. So in an ideological marketing positioning, the more, the better. This proves that the more, the worse. And that is likely to be true. For the benefit of looking for more things, you are spoiling by 4 times the goodness of screening for Downs. But I will come back to that. Now, the laboratories will give you results as screen positive or screen negative, as good or bad. And I think that that is not the right way of giving the results. And we have discussed this with Javier and Vincenzo, and we will be working towards incorporating the information that you get from the cell-free DNA test with the results of previous tests to get a more accurate interpretation of the results for the individual patient. Because in every screening test, the final result very much depends on what your background risk is. If you are already at an extremely high risk for a condition, and the results of a new test show a high risk, then it is very likely that you have a problem. But if your background risk is very, very low, and the new test suggests that you have a high risk, then it is likely that your risk is not all that high. This is a general principle of screening. Now, in addition to what your prior risk is, we have already heard the importance of the fetal fraction. Now, what is this fetal fraction? DNA comes from the placenta that belongs to the baby into the mother's blood. In cases where the baby has a problem, it is more easy to identify the problem in the mother's blood if there is a lot of the fetal DNA. And this is what the fetal fraction is. The more the DNA that comes from the baby, the more accurate the test in the mother's blood would be in predicting a problem in the baby. It is very, very basic. And different methods are trying to take into account this fact. And we have heard tonight one approach where mathematically you can estimate the amount of DNA in the mother's blood that comes from the baby. And this is by looking at the two ends of the DNA, because the size of the DNA in the baby is different from the size of the mother, and you're exploiting this difference in suspecting or predicting how much is the amount of DNA that comes from the mother. So that's 1. And 2, you are interpreting the results on the basis of the difference between normality and abnormality, taking into account this fetal fraction. So this is just a process of thinking through the interpretation of results by taking into account the prior risk. It's a mathematical concept that if you divide the detection rate by the false positive rate, you have this positive likelihood ratio, and the other way around, you get a negative likelihood ratio, which means that if you get a result from a test and it says bad, the degree of badness needs to take into account what was your starting risk, and you multiply the starting risk by this positive likelihood ratio. And the negative likelihood ratio is how good is the goodness of the test. If you get a result saying the baby is good, how true is that? And you multiply the background risk by this negative likelihood ratio. And this is an example of how you would do that. If you have a woman that has a very, very low risk to begin with, let's say 1 in 100,000, and the cell-free DNA test says the baby is affected, well, you increase the chances that the baby will be affected by a factor, the positive likelihood ratio, which is more than 1,000. But since the starting risk is very, very low, even if you increase that risk by 1,000 times, the final chances that the baby will be affected is 1%. And you have seen from the presentation of Vincenzo that we have one false positive case of Downs. Maybe false positive means that the test showed that the baby had Downs, but the baby did not have Downs. Well, to me, I'm not surprised by this because it's a screening test. And if you take into account the prior risk, you can avoid some of these false positives. The other way around, if you have an extremely high risk, the woman is 50, the nuchal translucency is 4, the free beta HCG is 3, the PAB is 0.2, and the cell-free DNA test comes back and it says the baby is normal, well, say, is it really normal? Let me look at the fetal fraction. If the fetal fraction is low, the test says the baby is normal, and the baby says, I am not normal, then the baby is likely to be right and not the test. So the doctor needs to be intelligent and not become a simple translator of a basic report. This is the concept of the fetal fraction. The higher the proportion of DNA in the mother's blood that comes from the baby, the greater is the difference between Downs and normal. The lower the fetal fraction, the greater is the overlap between normality and abnormality, and therefore the greater is the chance that the test will be inaccurate at that end. But you have seen a process where by deeper sequencing, you are narrowing the normal, you are narrowing the abnormal, so the curves are beginning to separate from each other. And then you saw how if you define a new score, not only do they do that, but actually they begin to separate that way as well. So you are beginning mathematically to make the test more accurate even in lower fetal fractions. So in the United States, the American College has recommended that in the cases where you have a failed result, you should have an invasive test. But this is a completely stupid way of thinking about things. They're saying that women should have this cell-free DNA test. The failure rate from the test is depending on something between 1% and 5%. And if you impulsively do an invasive test for a failed result, then you will automatically introduce invasive testing in 1 to 5% of the population at the back of a test whose main aim is to avoid an invasive test. So this is intellectually inadequate, impulsive, non-scientific way of American behavior. Now, the real question is, why is it that the test fails? Well, one of the main reasons why the test fails is what we discussed, that the DNA that comes from the baby into the mother is very low. And that depends on the amount of the placenta, the source of this DNA. The smaller the placenta, the less the DNA that comes from the mother to the baby. In Down syndrome, this is from another research fellow from Spain again, a recent study that we carried out. In cases of Down syndrome, the placenta, the DNA that comes into the mother's blood, is exactly the same as in normal babies. So you do not have an increased chance that in the failed result you will have Downs. So there is no moral, intellectual, or scientific justification for doing an invasive test just because the test has failed. In the cases of trisomy 18 and 13, because the placenta is small, then you have a higher chance that you will get a failed or an inaccurate result. But then in those cases, you don't do an invasive test. In Europe, we can do ultrasound scans. And there are many, many brilliant people in this audience that can do a scan if the result fails, and you can see whether the baby has trisomy 18 or 13, rather than impulsively do an invasive test. So the correct approach to the management of a failed result is to repeat the test. And you have seen today, I think, I haven't seen these results before, in the cases where they repeated the test, in 80% of the cases, or more, 89% of the cases, they got the result. And since now they have shrunk the interval between sampling and receiving a result to 3 days, well, if it fails, you repeat the test, and in 3 days again, or 4 days after that, so 1 week altogether, you will have a result in the vast majority of cases. So don't do an invasive test, do a repeat test. And if the test is failing again, do an ultrasound scan. Now, let me now discuss this concept of who should be having the test. I am fighting my own battles in England, and it's good for me to fight, because if you fight, you're alive. When you stop fighting, you're dead. I don't want to die yet. I disagree with the policy, as I have told you before, because it is a quick political solution based on some perverted, wrong economic formula, rather than recognizing the benefits of the new technology and interpreting them correctly. I believe that the best approach for countries like Spain and England that already have an infrastructure for a good combined test, they define the risk from that, and if the risk is very, very high, they should be strongly encouraging women to have an invasive test, not only because in that subgroup, which is very, very small, you will already pick up very effectively a very high proportion of the main trisomies, but also of many other chromosomal abnormalities. The number of invasive tests is going to be very small. The type of invasive test inevitably will change from traditional karyotyping to array CGH. So that is one way of thinking and one approach to what we should be doing. I think at this end of the spectrum, when the risk is less than 1 in 1,000, something that we find in 76% of the population, when the residual risk of chromosomal abnormalities in the name of trisomy 21, 18, 13, and so on is very, very, very small. In the private sector, of course, you can offer anything to anybody, but within a nationalized healthcare system, to say the least, in countries like Spain and in Greece, where there is a massive youth unemployment, there are so many other economic problems, actually, by advocating that we should be doing this test for these groups, we will create enemies against the goodness of the cffDNA test rather than the other way around. However, in the middle group, and this will depend on how much money the healthcare system would have, how much money the test will cost, then the middle group with a risk of 1 in 10 to 1 in 1,000, which is 24%, or 1 in 10 to 1 in 500, which is 15%, depending on how much you are prepared to set your limits at, then that group should be having the cffDNA test, and there is completely abundant evidence for the goodness of this test. So I strongly believe in that, and the cffDNA test in at least the 15% of the population with the risk down to 1 in 500. And it can be easily affordable. So the questions that you must be asking Neobona is, how can they reduce the cost for the benefit of more people? Now, let me finish with this. Now, I have a problem. I come from Cyprus, a country that has suffered at the hands of American ideology and insensitivity, a country that has been one of those in the Middle East that has suffered from this cowboyish attitude to all sorts of aspects of life. And therefore, I start from that point. I think it is wrong, purely because when you go into a shop, they tell you, for the same price, you can get a Big Mac, and you can get also a big chocolate milkshake and a lot of chips, because it may taste nice for that moment, but then you get very fat and stupid, like a lot of the people in the country that advocate this ideology. It is not good for you to have the extra that make you fatter and more stupid. Why? I think it is wrong to be screening for sex chromosomal aneuploidies just because we can do it. What are these sex chromosomal abnormalities? 47 XYY, like me. Do you think there is something wrong with me? Do you understand? But do they understand? I don't have XYY, but I wish I did. Why should we screen for this condition? Why should we screen for 45X in the absence of increased nuchal translucency, in the absence of a coarctation of the aorta? For what? For what condition are we actually screening for? Why should we be screening for 47XXX? 90% of these women will be born, have a normal life, and die, and nobody would know that there was anything wrong with them. That is the principle of what is it that we are screening for. Number two, half of the sex chromosomal abnormalities are mosaics. Mosaics means 50-50, a bit of abnormal. Number one. Number two, it means that quite often the abnormality is in the placenta and not in the baby. The conditions are individually rare. The test will often be identifying a problem that is not a real problem, will be identifying a problem that will be worrying people, that will lead to another invasive test, when the whole philosophy of cffDNA testing was to reduce invasive testing, and quite often it will prove to be wrong. And if it is right, then you stop and you say, what is so bad about these conditions? So I am completely against putting a tick to get an extra big portion of chips just because you are stupid to go and buy McDonald's in the first place. This one, I think it's important. This is the future, because with genetic testing, it is an advance to be able to identify seriously handicapping conditions for the parents that they would have otherwise missed. So I want to see a lot more research. I want to see the LabCorp, I want to see Illumina doing a lot more research in that area. But I think at the moment, we do not have very basic answers to the questions. How common are these conditions? How accurate is the test for each one of those conditions? What is the false positive rate? And unless we answer those questions, I think it is irresponsible for us to put another tick to now get a big chocolate milkshake because you were stupid enough to buy McDonald's in the first place. So this is what I believe. Now, in the meantime, to finish, because if I don't finish, Javier will be very angry with me. Let me reiterate the results. Thanks to the many Spanish research fellows that come and work with me, and the many other research fellows that come from many other countries, and my obsession of properly documenting our findings at an enormous cost, let me tell you, more than £300,000 every year, multiplied by 1.2 to get the euros, I buy extremely expensive freezers and extremely expensive little tubes from every patient that we see to collect the bloods. So we have a lot of fridges with a lot of blood samples. When the cell-free testing came, people came to me from all of the companies, and they wanted the tests. And because I thought that they loved me because I looked sexy. But then I realized that before they came to me, they went to some American university and they asked them for £3 million to give them the test. So they came to me because I knew that I was stupid and I would give them to them for free. And I thought I was sexy. So I gave samples to all of the companies. And because I believed that it was important, that there was something important in this new era that we needed to advance medicine. And that actually helped many of the companies in the development of their tests. So when Javier came with Vincenzo and asked me for samples, I would automatically say yes. But in the meantime, we had also developed, as he mentioned, a friendship. We had been collaborating previously in relation to the cell-free testing that was being offered in Spain and what we were offering in Greece, in Greece. I wish, in England, in terms of how do we select the patients, how accurate are the various tests, and so on. So I said yes. But in their case, I was stingy. For all of the companies, I gave 2 or 4 ml. But I had spent them all, and all I had left for some of the samples was 1 ml. So I say 1 ml. And I told them a lie. I said, if you are good, you can do it, because that's what I gave to all of the other companies, which was a lie. So I gave them 1 ml of plasma from 1,000 pregnancies. And they had a failure rate in this 1 ml in 1.2%, which was lower, much lower than I would expect. And they got the test right for the conditions that matter. They got it right in the case of Downs, and they had no false positives. And there was one case of trisomy 18 that they got it wrong. And I would have been surprised if it was everything 100%, because then most probably it would look like a propaganda leaflet rather than a real scientific study. So that is that. Now, I think that cell-free DNA testing is a brilliant test. I think it is a brilliant test for Downs and okay for trisomy 18 and 13, and a disaster for everything else at the moment. In the interpretation of results, it is critical that we don't enter a period where, as fetal medicine experts, we become stupid and we stop thinking. This is a challenge for us to think even more. This is a challenge to prove that we are even better in fetal medicine. Decide what is the risk for your patient before you do a test, so that you can properly interpret the results of the test when they come from the laboratory. Look at how different companies are presenting their results. How do they cope? How do they handle this issue of the fetal fraction? And look for the ones that will be combining intelligently, mathematically intelligently, the prior risk, the results of an element of the fetal fraction with the likelihood ratio that arises from the test, to give you a posterior risk that is individualized for each patient. I think that in the management of a failed result, you don't do an invasive test. You take another blood sample, you send it to the same company, and you tell them, you failed, you do the next test, and I will not pay you for it. And in the vast majority of cases, you will get the result the second time round. And if you don't, and you are concerned about trisomy 18 and 15, do an ultrasound scan for God's sake, rather than an invasive test. I think the day would be great when we'll be able to afford to do this test on everybody. But in the meantime, I think that we must not destroy what we have, but we must build on what we have. I think that we must be fighting for healthcare systems to be adopting, at the moment, cell-free DNA testing for something in the region of 10 to 15% at least of the population, at least those with a risk cutoff of more than 1 in 500, preferably in those of more than 1 in 1,000. I think I have spoken too much. Thank you.
Desgraciadamente, el profesor Nicolaides tiene otros compromisos y nos va a tener que abandonar antes de tiempo. Entonces, aunque queda un ponente más, la doctora Coffin, avanzamos las preguntas que hay para el profesor Nicolaides, luego intervendrá la doctora Coffin y acabaremos con preguntas para ella y para el...
What does coffin mean? He wants to put me in a coffin. What is the coffin? What is coffin?
Dr. Christine Coffin.
I thought
I'm sorry for that. No worries, no. Si hay preguntas para el profesor Nicolaides, por favor. No veo nada con esta luz. ¿Alguna pregunta para el doctor? ¿Alguna pregunta para el profesor Nicolaides?
They want to see me going out in a coffin.
Vincenzo, tú tenías una pregunta, Far. Sí. Micrófono, Far.
Not too sure. I had a question ready for you. I was curious to hear about you already explained about your opinion on the expanding the test for other conditions. Do you really foresee at some point this is really possible? And if it's the case, would be worth to include this in a screening test?
Right.
We are taking a very, very rare condition.
Let's answer that question in a different way. Tomorrow, in the hospital where Mari is working with Professor Belen, we will be having a course with a small group of good people to be discussing different aspects of fetal medicine. Now, when cell-free DNA was introduced by the various companies, there was a propaganda that the risk of miscarriage from invasive testing is 1%. Now, that was reinvented from a 1980s paper from Denmark, from Ann Tabor. Ranjita Koleka, who is here tonight, has published an intelligent analysis of the risk of miscarriage from CVS, for example. And we found that if you take a woman and she's sitting 10 meters from a doctor, just say, hello, and then you don't see this woman again, some women will miscarry. And the chances that that woman that you saw in the chair, you said, hello, will miscarry, are higher if this woman is older. They are higher if the nuchal translucency is increased. They are higher if the Pabé is low. And she just said, hello. But sometimes women develop psychological problems depending on how you say the hello, and they miscarry. If you take the same woman and you do a CVS, some women will miscarry. If you take into account these factors for which you do a CVS, and then you analyze them, you will realize that the risk that you will miscarry from an invasive test over and above the risk that you would miscarry just because you said hello is nearly, in the hands of good people, nearly 0%. So, the question now, why is it important? I think that many women, and that's what we were finding in England, in our studies now with the cffDNA test, do not want to have an invasive test. There's something about the needle coming into them. We, obstetricians, in a mathematical way of thinking, we try to explain that on the fear that they will miscarry. But I think it's much more than that. I don't think that they take into account the specific mathematics of the risk of miscarriage in deciding. They do a bit in deciding whether they want to have an invasive test. It's the whole idea of having something coming into them. They want to avoid having an invasive test. But if the women knew that the risk of miscarriage was extremely low, and if they knew that with any screening test, the information that we would get is very, very limited, and there is now the potential from array CGH, from an invasive test, that they will learn a hell of a lot more about the condition of their babies, some of the women will be choosing to have an invasive test. The question from Vincenzo was, will we someday soon be able, from analysis of the cffDNA in the mother's blood, get the same information that you can get from array CGH of the chorionic villi or the amniotic fluid? Vincenzo, I hope that is not because I'm too old, but I don't think that that is going to happen someday soon. But then someday soon may be 3 years or 5 or 10, I do not know. So I still believe that if you're going to go to the argument, I want to know about everything, well, the women can have an invasive test, and you are very, very good in doing their genetic testing. You have been doing it in Spain for many, many years. And for those women, we can reassure them that the risk that they will miscarry is well below 1% if they want to know about everything. I think that the cffDNA tests will become more and more accurate. The technology inevitably will improve, and many more of the important microdeletions will be accessible. But I want to see more scientific studies so that if we introduce these tests, we can at least give the women the minimum information on detection rate and false positive rate, positive predictive value.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Delante a la derecha. Si la puedo hacer en inglés, doctor, mejor para el profesor Nicolaides.
Hello, Professor. Thanks very much for the excellent talk. It's always amazing to hear you, and it's very funny, as everybody knows. And this is a question for, also congratulations, Vincenzo. It's an impressive test that you have developed. And this is a question for both. It's about twins. It's a question that a lot of people is asking about. Detection rates in twins is the same. We have validated the test for twins. Thanks.
It's very simple, really. There are two types of twins. We have monochorionic twins and dichorionic twins. If you have monochorionic twins, they are invariably monozygotic. They are exactly the same as in a singleton pregnancy. The problem is the dichorionic twins, and in dichorionic twins, it is possible, it happens, that one baby is normal and the other baby is abnormal. Free beta HCG, PAP-A, second trimester serum biochemistry in twin pregnancies was possible, but was more problematic than in a singleton pregnancy for the very simple fact that the free beta HCG and the papain produced by the normal placenta was masking the abnormality of the abnormal placenta. The same is true for cell-free DNA testing. And therefore, we have to be careful when we are analyzing the results into having that in mind. That if you have a baby with Downs and a normal baby, especially if the placenta of the normal baby is bigger than the placenta of the Downs baby, the cell-free DNA, the excess for chromosome number 21 that will come from the Downs baby will be masked by the cell-free DNA of the normal baby. To overcome this problem, some of the companies are specifically looking to distinguish between the two fetuses and at least look at the fetal fraction of the one with the lowest fetal fraction to avoid the problem of overshadowing an abnormality by a normality. We looked at the results, and tomorrow Pedia Ceviva from Bulgaria, that will be talking in this meeting, will be presenting the pathetic small number of papers that have been published in twins. Really, really very, very small. The companies in their propaganda leaflets, they say thousands, millions, everything is fantastic, God is Chinese, and everybody believes it because they said it. The truth of the matter is that there are pathetically few papers that have properly evaluated these chromosomal abnormalities. If you take into account this problem of the potential masking of the one by the other, we did a study, actually, we published, and Vincenzo presented his results as part of a collaborative study, and we found two things. That in twin pregnancies, if you want to avoid this wrong diagnosis, you set up a higher criterion for acceptance of a test, and therefore, by definition, you end up having a higher failure rate. It's another problem that we haven't worked out. A lot of twins now that will be appearing in any program of cell-free DNA testing will be women that have had IVF. Here we have an older woman that has struggled to get pregnant. She has an IVF pregnancy. The last thing in the world she wants to do is to have an invasive test. She has a cell-free DNA test. For some weird reason, in the cases where you have had IVF and twins, you have a much higher failure rate. So there are problems with twins. Yes, the test can be done, but there are problems.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicolaides. Unfortunately, I think you need to leave. So
you don't like me. You want me to get out?
Yeah, well, it'll be a pity to miss you for the rest of the event, but I think Dr. Santa Cruz will want you to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.